"Claire, please don't start tonight," my husband whispered while adjusting the sleeve of my black blazer in the parking lot outside the restaurant. "Vanessa's boyfriend is important. Just let him talk." I stared at him for a second, the cold Chicago wind catching loose strands of my hair while valet attendants rushed around us under gold lights. "I wasn't planning to start anything," I said quietly. Ethan forced a smile like I was the difficult one. "Good. Because these people are different." Different. That word sat in my chest the entire elevator ride to the private dining room on the 32nd floor. The moment we walked in, my younger sister Vanessa practically glowed under the chandelier light. Cream silk dress, diamond bracelet, perfect hair. Her new boyfriend, Dominic Mercer, stood beside her, holding a glass of bourbon like he owned the building. "There they are," my mother said, but her smile faded when she looked at me. "Claire, sweetheart, you came straight from work?" I glanced down at my dark slacks and simple blouse. "Yeah, I drove in from Fort Sheridan." Dominic smirked before I even sat down. "Military, huh?" he asked. "That explains the posture." A few people laughed softly. Ethan chuckled too. I felt that one deeper than I expected. Dinner started with lobster ravioli and conversations about investment firms, lake houses, and ski trips in Aspen. Every topic somehow drifted away from me like I wasn't fully part of the table. Then Dominic looked directly at me and said, "So what exactly do you do in the Army? Paperwork? Scheduling?" Vanessa laughed into her wine glass. "Claire's always been the practical one." My mother nodded immediately. "Stable, responsible. Not everyone needs to be ambitious." Something tightened behind my ribs. 14 years in uniform, 2 overseas deployments, nights sleeping in command tents while building a second life nobody at this table had ever bothered asking about. And somehow I was still the boring daughter. Ethan leaned toward me when he noticed my silence. "Just ignore it," he muttered. "Don't make this awkward." I looked at him carefully then. Really looked at him. The man I married couldn't even defend me for 10 seconds at a dinner table. Dominic kept going. "Honestly, government jobs would drive me insane," he said, cutting into his steak. "No offense, Claire, but I could never live that small." Everyone laughed again. Even my father smiled into his scotch. I wrapped my fingers around my water glass so tightly, the ice cracked softly inside it. Then my phone buzzed against the table. The screen lit up bright enough for Dominic to notice the name before I could turn it over. Marcus Hale, Pentagon Procurement Division. Dominic's smile disappeared for half a second, and that was the exact moment I realized something dangerous. He recognized the name, but he still had no idea who I really was. Dominic recovered fast, but not completely. I noticed the way his fingers tightened around his bourbon glass after seeing that name on my screen. "Pentagon Procurement?" he asked casually, trying too hard to sound relaxed. I turned my phone face down beside my plate. "Just work." He nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on me longer this time. Across the table, Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Claire always makes everything sound mysterious," she said. "Meanwhile, she probably just signs forms all day." My mother laughed softly like she had heard that joke 100 times before. The truth was, she had. Growing up, Vanessa was always the one people stopped to admire. At 12, she got a white piano in the living room because she mentioned wanting lessons once. When I asked for running shoes for cross-country practice, my father told me the old pair still looked fine. Vanessa got applause. I got practicality. Even now, sitting under the warm amber lighting of that expensive restaurant, I could still hear my mother's voice from years ago. "Claire does not need attention," she used to say while fixing Vanessa's hair before school dances. "She is independent." Independent really meant invisible. I remember one Christmas morning when I was 16. Vanessa opened diamond earrings from my father and screamed loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I opened thermal socks because I had mentioned Army training camps during dinner a month earlier. "These are useful," my mother had said proudly. Useful. That word followed me my entire life. Useful daughter. Useful wife. Useful officer. Never extraordinary. Ethan reached for another bread roll beside me and smiled at Dominic. "Claire was always intense, even in college," he said. I used to beg her to relax. Everyone laughed again. I stared at the candle flickering in the center of the table and realized something painful. They had all built the same version of me together over the years. Quiet. Predictable. Safe. And none of them had the slightest idea what I had been doing after midnight for the last 6 years. The first time my life started changing, nobody in my family noticed. 6 years ago, I was sitting alone in a dim operations office at Fort Bragg at nearly 2 in the morning, eating stale peanut butter crackers from a vending machine while reviewing delayed supply routes overseas. Rain tapped softly against the narrow window beside my desk, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead hard enough to make my head ache. That was the night I realized the military transport systems we relied on were years behind what they needed to be. Too many delays, too much wasted fuel, too many contractors overcharging the government because nobody had modernized the process properly. I remember opening my laptop after my shift ended and sketching the first rough logistics model on a legal pad beside my coffee cup. Nothing glamorous. Just numbers, routing chains, timing algorithms, and freight patterns. The beginning of Aegis Defense Logistics fit inside a notebook stained with black coffee. Back then, Ethan barely looked up from the couch when I came home after midnight. "You are working again?" he asked one night while flipping through television channels. "It is just an idea," I told him. "Something that could help streamline transport contracts." He laughed softly. "Claire, you already work 60 hours a week. Not everybody needs to build an empire." I laughed too, because I thought he was teasing. Now I realize he never believed I could build anything important. A year later, one of my models cut fuel waste by 12% during a live training exercise. A Pentagon contractor called me personally after seeing the numbers. I still remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone while pasta boiled behind me. "Lieutenant Colonel Bennett," the man said, "whoever designed this system understands logistics better than most private firms in Washington." My hands actually shook. It was the first time anyone had looked at my work and seen more than reliability, more than usefulness. When I told my mother about the contract meeting a week later, she smiled politely and asked if Vanessa was still invited to a charity gala in Napa Valley. That was it. No questions, no curiosity, just silence. Across the dinner table tonight, Dominic suddenly leaned forward, studying me carefully now instead of dismissing me. Then he smiled slowly and said, "Wait a second, Aegis Defense Logistics sounds familiar." And for the first time all evening, Ethan stopped smiling. The air at the table changed so subtly, most people would not have noticed it. Dominic leaned back slowly, studying me now with the same attention he had been giving investment conversations all night. "Hold on," he said carefully. "Aegis Defense Logistics. Where have I heard that before?" Ethan answered before I could. "Probably nowhere," he laughed quickly. "Claire just likes complicated military names." The speed of his response made my stomach tighten. Dominic did not laugh this time. He kept staring at me. "No," he said quietly. "I heard that name in a meeting last month." Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. "Dominic sits in meetings all day. Every company sounds familiar to him." But Ethan jumped in again almost immediately. "Claire does not own a company," he said, smiling at the table like he was cleaning up an awkward misunderstanding. "She just consults on small side projects sometimes." Small side projects. I looked at him carefully, while the candlelight flickered against his wine glass. He knew I worked late every night. He knew strangers from Washington called my phone at odd hours. He knew contracts arrived at our house in sealed overnight envelopes twice a month. He just never asked questions, because the version of me he preferred was simpler, easier. Dominic narrowed his eyes slightly. "What kind of consulting?" he asked. Before I could answer, my mother spoke first. "Claire has always been good with organization," she said warmly. "Schedules, logistics, responsible things. Responsible things. Like my entire life could fit inside a label somebody else picked for me 20 years ago." I suddenly remembered a dinner 3 years earlier when Ethan had introduced me to one of his coworkers as, "My wife Claire, she works for the government." That was it. Not officer, not strategist, not founder. Just works for the government. I laughed softly under my breath now, but there was no humor left in it. Dominic reached for his phone. "Actually," he said slowly, "I think Aegis is bidding on a defense transport expansion project right now." Ethan's face changed instantly. "Dominic," he said sharply, "drop it." The entire table went quiet for the first time all night, and that was the exact moment I realized my husband was not embarrassed by me. He was terrified of what happened if people finally saw me clearly. Nobody said much after that. The energy at the table collapsed into something stiff and uncomfortable, like everyone suddenly realized they might have missed an important detail about me years ago. Dominic checked his phone twice in less than a minute. Vanessa kept forcing little laughs that sounded thinner every time. My father cleared his throat and reached for his scotch again without looking at me. And Ethan would not meet my eyes at all. Dinner ended early after that. People stood, hugged awkwardly, adjusted coats, avoided conversation. Outside the restaurant, cold wind rushed between the buildings while black SUVs pulled up one after another under the glowing valet lights. Ethan followed me toward the parking garage. "Claire, wait." I kept walking. My heels clicked sharply against the concrete floor while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said finally. I stopped so suddenly he almost walked into me. "Embarrassed you?" I turned around slowly. "That is what you got from tonight?" Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "You know what I mean. Dominic is connected. Vanessa finally has someone serious, and now everybody thinks we lied to them. We, not him. Not the family. We." I stared at this man I had shared a home with for 14 years and realized he was still more worried about appearances than the fact he never truly knew his own wife. My phone buzzed again. Another missed call from Marcus Hale. Then an email notification appeared underneath it. "Urgent. Contract review before morning meeting." Ethan saw it clearly this time. "Claire," he said carefully, "how much money are we actually talking about here? Not how are you? Not why did you hide this? Just money." I laughed softly before I could stop myself, and something in my expression must have unsettled him because he took a small step back. Later that night, he sent 3 text messages after I locked myself inside the guest bedroom. I did not answer any of them. The first said, "We need to talk." The second, "I think you misunderstood tonight." The third came at 1:14 the morning. "Claire, what else do I not know about you?" I stared at that message alone in the dark, while the city lights flickered faintly through the curtains, and for the first time in my marriage, I felt completely invisible and completely alone at the exact same time. The next 3 weeks felt strangely quiet after that dinner. Not peaceful, just hollow. Ethan started moving around the apartment carefully, like someone walking through a room full of broken glass. He stopped making jokes about my work, stopped teasing me about late nights. But somehow that hurt more because now every silence between us felt deliberate. One Tuesday morning, I found him standing inside my home office doorway before sunrise. The blue glow from my monitors lit half his face, while contract maps and shipping projections covered the screens behind me. "You really built all this?" he asked quietly. I looked back at the spreadsheets without answering. Outside, snow drifted slowly past the windows over downtown Chicago. "Claire," he said again, softer this time, "why did you never tell me?" I almost laughed at the question. "I tried," I said finally. "You just never stayed interested long enough to listen." He stood there for a few seconds after that with both hands in his pockets, staring at the floor instead of me. Then he nodded once and walked away. That somehow felt worse than yelling would have. A few days later, my mother called while I was reviewing contracts in my office at Fort Sheridan. "Vanessa feels terrible about dinner," she said immediately. "No, hello. No, how are you? Does she?" I asked. Silence crackled faintly through the line. "You know how your sister is," my mother continued carefully. "She did not realize your business was successful. Successful." Another small word trying to reduce something enormous. "That was never the problem," I said quietly. My mother exhaled sharply. "Claire, families say things they do not mean sometimes." I stared out the office window at gray February clouds hanging low over the lakefront. "No," I answered. "Families usually mean them. They just expect forgiveness afterward." She did not call again after that. Neither did Vanessa. At night, I started staying later at work, even when I did not need to. The operations building emptied out around 9 o'clock, leaving only humming lights, coffee machines, and distant footsteps in long, empty hallways. I realized I felt less alone there than I did inside my own marriage. And somewhere inside that silence, something cold and steady began replacing the part of me that used to beg people to see my worth. Spring came slowly that year. Chicago stayed gray well into March, the sidewalks wet with melting snow and salt stains that never seemed to disappear. I started waking up before 5 again, not because the army demanded it, but because for the first time in years I wanted mornings that belonged only to me. Most days began with black coffee, quiet apartment lights, and 3 monitors glowing inside my office while the city outside was still asleep. Aegis grew fast after the Pentagon expansion contract moved into final review. Faster than I expected, faster than I could comfortably explain to people who had spent years assuming I barely understood business at all. One Friday afternoon, Marcus Hale walked beside me through a logistics conference in Arlington, while defense contractors circled conversations around us like sharks sensing money. "You know, half these people spent the last year trying to figure out who owns Aegis," he said with a grin. "You staying invisible drove them insane." I adjusted the sleeve of my blazer and kept walking. "Good," Marcus laughed quietly. "You really do enjoy watching people underestimate you." The truth was, I did not enjoy it anymore. I was just used to it. Back in Chicago, Ethan started trying harder around the apartment. He cooked dinner twice in 1 week, even though he hated cooking. He asked questions now, real ones. "How many employees do you have? When did the contract start? Were you scared building this alone?" But every conversation felt strangely late, like receiving flowers after the funeral already ended. One evening, he stood near the kitchen counter while rain tapped softly against the windows. "I can change, Claire," he said carefully. "I know I failed you." I kept organizing contract folders inside my briefcase without looking up. "That is the problem, Ethan," I answered quietly. "You only started seeing me after other people did." He had no response to that. 2 weeks later, Aegis received an invitation to present at a major defense logistics summit in Washington. Marcus called personally. "Claire," he said, "after this conference, everybody is going to know your name." I stared out across the dark Chicago skyline after the call ended, and for the first time in a very long time, the future no longer felt small. Washington smelled like rain and polished marble the morning of the summit. Black SUVs lined the curb outside the convention center, while security officers checked credentials beneath massive glass doors, reflecting the gray sky overhead. I stood in front of the mirror inside the women's restroom for a moment before my presentation, adjusting the collar of my Army dress uniform, Lieutenant Colonel Claire Bennett. The silver oak leaves on my shoulders caught the light every time I moved. Beneath my conference badge, another line sat in clean black lettering. Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Aegis Defense Logistics. For years, I had hidden one identity behind the other. That morning, both finally stood in the same room together. "Ma'am, they are ready for you," a young event coordinator said nervously outside the door. I nodded once and followed her through a crowded hallway, buzzing with conversations about contracts, fuel chains, overseas routing, and acquisition forecasts. Halfway to the stage, I heard someone say my name quietly behind me. "Claire?" I turned and nearly stopped walking. Dominic stood near one of the sponsor displays, holding a conference folder against his chest. His face looked different now, less confident. "I did not know you were speaking here," he admitted. "Most people did not," I answered calmly. His eyes dropped briefly to my badge, then back to me again. "You built all this yourself?" I thought about the years of empty apartments, late flights, cold coffee, deployment schedules, and silent weekends spent coding freight systems, while everyone else assumed I had no ambition at all. "No," I said softly. "I built it while people were busy underestimating me." Dominic looked like he wanted to say something else, but applause suddenly erupted from inside the ballroom as my name appeared across the massive screen at the front of the stage. Marcus Hale met me near the entrance with a grin. "Ready to become very difficult to ignore?" he asked quietly. I smiled for the first time that day. I think that already started. Then I walked onto the stage beneath bright white lights, while hundreds of executives, officers, and contractors turned toward me at once. And somewhere back in Chicago, my husband was only beginning to understand what he had almost lost. 3 days after the summit, my mother invited the whole family to Sunday dinner for the first time since the restaurant incident. The message appeared in the family group chat at 8:12 that morning. We should all spend time together after Claire's big conference success. Success. Even now, she could not quite bring herself to call it mine. I almost did not go. But something inside me needed to see them again, now that the illusion had cracked. Their house looked exactly the same when I pulled into the driveway that evening. White brick, perfect hedges, warm yellow light glowing through the front windows like nothing painful had ever happened there. Inside, the smell of rosemary chicken and expensive candles filled the air. Vanessa hugged me too tightly the moment I walked in. "Claire, oh my God, everybody is talking about you online," she said with a nervous laugh. "Dominic saw your presentation clips everywhere. Dominic stood near the dining room holding a glass of wine, suddenly quieter than the man who mocked me weeks earlier. Your logistics model was impressive, he admitted carefully. Very impressive. I thanked him politely and hung my coat near the doorway. Ethan arrived 10 minutes later carrying flowers for my mother like he was trying to restore normalcy through routine. But nothing about the room felt normal anymore. During dinner, conversations moved cautiously around me now. My father asked about defense contracts. My mother suddenly wanted details about Washington. Vanessa kept mentioning how proud she was of her brilliant sister. The performance almost would have been convincing if I had not waited my entire life to hear those exact words. Then Ethan cleared his throat softly beside me. Actually, he said, setting down his fork, there is something I need to tell everyone. The room went still immediately. I looked at him carefully. His hands were shaking slightly beneath the table. Ethan? My mother asked nervously. He stared down at his wineglass for a long second before finally speaking again. The truth is, there is a reason Claire kept so much of her life separate from me. Something cold moved through my chest. Because suddenly I realized this conversation was no longer about my business at all, and whatever Ethan was about to say next was going to change everything. Ethan kept staring at the wineglass in front of him, like the answer might be sitting somewhere inside it. Nobody moved. Even the soft jazz playing through the ceiling speakers suddenly felt too loud in the silence. Finally, he exhaled slowly and looked at my parents across the table. Claire did not hide her company because she was arrogant, he said quietly. She hid it because none of us ever made room for her to be anything except useful. My mother blinked hard. Ethan, no, he interrupted gently. You all need to hear this. I sat perfectly still beside him while candlelight flickered against the polished dining table. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. For years, I treated my wife like background noise in her own life. We all did. Vanessa crossed her arms immediately. That is not fair. Ethan looked directly at her. You called her boring for 15 years. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair while Dominic stared down at his folded hands. Ethan turned toward my mother next. Do you remember when Claire got promoted to lieutenant colonel? My mother hesitated. Of course I do. You asked her to leave the ceremony early because Vanessa had a charity event downtown and you did not want to arrive late. The room went silent again. I remembered that day perfectly. My uniform pressed sharply. Ethan standing beside me in photographs, smiling proudly for cameras. Then driving downtown immediately afterward because Vanessa's event mattered more. Ethan rubbed his jaw slowly. I watched my wife build a multi-million-dollar defense company at the kitchen table after midnight, while all of us kept acting like she was the least accomplished person in every room. Nobody argued with him this time, because nobody could. My phone buzzed softly beside my plate. A new email notification lit the screen bright enough for everyone nearby to see it. Acquisition offer revision, $8.2 million valuation. Dominic saw the number first. His face lost color instantly. Vanessa leaned forward sharply. 8.2 million? She whispered. My mother looked at me like she was seeing a stranger, but the hardest part was not the shock on their faces. It was realizing that for the first time in my life, they were finally listening only because money forced them to. Nobody touched their food after that. The candles kept burning low in the center of the table while silverware sat untouched beside half-finished plates growing cold. My mother looked shaken in a way I had never seen before. Claire, she said carefully, why did you never tell us things had become this serious? I stared at her for a long moment before answering. Because every time I tried talking about my work, someone changed the subject to Vanessa. The honesty landed harder than anger would have. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside Dominic. That is not true, she said quietly, but even she did not sound convinced. I looked at my younger sister calmly. You once interrupted me in the middle of explaining a deployment schedule because you wanted everyone to see photos from a rooftop party in Miami. Vanessa's cheeks flushed red. I did not think it mattered that much. Exactly, I answered softly. Silence spread through the room again. Ethan sat beside me with both hands clasped tightly together now, looking exhausted in a way I had never noticed before. My father finally spoke after nearly 10 minutes without a word. You should have been recognized for what you accomplished, he said stiffly. It sounded less like affection and more like regret arriving too late. I nodded once. Maybe, but I stopped building ages for recognition a long time ago. Dominic cleared his throat awkwardly. For what it is worth, Claire, I was wrong about you. I almost smiled at that. "No," I said gently. "You were wrong about what success looks like." The room went completely still after that, because deep down, they all understood the sentence was meant for more than just Dominic. My phone buzzed again beside my plate. Another investor email, another acquisition request, another reminder that my life had already moved beyond this dining room weeks ago. I stood slowly and reached for my coat near the back of my chair. Ethan looked up immediately. "Claire, are you coming home tonight?" There was so much uncertainty in his voice it barely sounded like him anymore. I paused for a second with my hand resting against the chair. "I do not know yet," I answered honestly. And judging by the expression on his face, that uncertainty frightened him more than losing the money ever could. 6 months later, my life looked quieter from the outside, but it finally felt honest. I moved into a smaller condo overlooking Lake Michigan, with floor-to-ceiling windows and almost no furniture except the things I actually loved. No oversized dining table for performances. No rooms designed to impress people who never really saw me. Most mornings started before sunrise with coffee in my hands and soft gray light spreading slowly across the water, while emails from Washington filled my inbox. Aegis officially finalized its acquisition deal in early September. $8.2 million. The number still felt unreal sometimes, not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. Every late night. Every deployment. Every moment I kept building, while people smiled politely and assumed I was ordinary. Ethan and I separated quietly 2 months after that final dinner. No screaming, no dramatic betrayal. Just two people sitting across from each other at our kitchen table, finally telling the truth after years of silence. "I loved you," he said one night while turning his wedding ring slowly against the wood tabletop. "I know," I answered softly. "But you loved the version of me that made your life comfortable," he cried after that. "So did I, because sometimes grief is not losing the person you loved. Sometimes it is realizing they never fully knew you at all." My relationship with my family changed too. Slower, more carefully. My mother calls now without comparing me to Vanessa first. My father asks real questions about my work instead of pretending to understand it. Vanessa apologized one afternoon over coffee with tears running quietly down her face. "I thought you did not care what people thought about you," she admitted. I looked out the cafe window for a long moment before answering. "I cared," I said gently. "I just got tired of begging people to see me clearly." The truth is, this story was never really about money. Money only forced people to pay attention. The real lesson was learning that if you spend your entire life shrinking yourself to make other people comfortable, eventually you disappear inside your own story. And if someone listening to me right now feels invisible inside their marriage, their family, their friendships, or even inside their own home, please hear me when I say this. Your value does not decrease just because somebody else failed to recognize it. Protect your peace. Protect your finances. Protect your sense of self. And trust that quiet work still matters, even when nobody applauds it yet. Sometimes God, or the universe, or simply life itself keeps certain victories hidden until your spirit is finally strong enough to carry them. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 38 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let other people define the size of your life before you have fully lived it yourself. Thank you for sitting with me through this story tonight. Truly. If any part of it spoke to your heart, I hope it reminded you that healing does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like morning light returning after a very long winter. And if you would like, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world tonight. I read more of them than you probably realize, and if this story resonated with you, you may find comfort in the other stories waiting in this playlist too. There are more families, more hidden truths, more quiet comebacks, and more people learning how to reclaim themselves after being underestimated for far too long. Sometimes one story leads you exactly where your heart needed to go next.